It was a quiet morning in the Colorado mountains. JetBlue Flight 1748 was getting ready to take off from a small airport called Hayden, Yampa Valley. The crew was doing their final checks, and passengers were settling into their seats. Everything felt routine. Outside, the weather was cold but clear. There was no air traffic control tower, just an open frequency where pilots called out their positions. That's normal at smaller airports like this. At first, it seemed like everything was working just fine, but then a message came over the radio. Another aircraft was on final approach from the opposite direction. Both crews thought they knew what the other was doing. Both believed they were in the right. But here's where things start to get confusing. Both planes thought they understood what the other was doing. Both crews believed they were in the right, and both were headed straight for the same runway. One was speeding up, the other was coming in to land. And neither of them truly saw the other until it was almost too late. So how did two planes end up on a collision course without realizing it? Why didn't the warning systems alert them? And what happened next, up in those thin mountain skies? This is the story of JetBlue Flight 1748. It was Saturday morning, January 22, 2022, at Hayden, Yampa Valley Airport in Colorado. The air was crisp and clear, with a bright blue sky stretching over the snowy mountains. Temperatures hovered just below freezing, but the day promised good weather for flying. Unlike big airports with control towers guiding every move, Hayden relies on pilots talking to each other over radios. Now, because this is a commercial airport with bigger planes flying scheduled routes, they still need to talk to air traffic control somewhere. That happens on a separate frequency with the Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, or ARTCC. So, planes flying under instrument flight plans keep two radios open, one tuned to the CTAF to manage local traffic, and the other connected to Denver ARTCC for route clearances and flight instructions. Everyone must pay close attention. One small mistake could quickly turn dangerous. In the 12 months before that day, there had been more than 11,000 takeoffs and landings. That's an average of about 30 per day. This included more than 2,000 commercial airliner movements, nearly 4,000 air taxi flights, and over 5,000 general aviation flights. JetBlue is one of the airlines flying seasonal services into Hayden, bringing passengers from faraway places like Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Because Hayden's airport environment is complex, JetBlue had a special briefing for pilots operating there. They were warned about the high minimum altitudes they needed to fly, the importance of clear radio communication, and the fact that planes often landed and took off on opposite runways at the same time. That morning, JetBlue Flight 1748 was ready to start its journey. The Airbus A320-232, tail number N760JB, was the star of the day. Built in 2008, it had flown over 50,588 hours, carrying passengers safely across the skies. Its powerful IAE V2527-A5 engines stood ready to roar to life. The plane was scheduled to fly more than 1,600 miles from snowy Colorado to sunny Florida to Fort Lauderdale International Airport, or FLL. On board were 108 people, passengers excited for their trip and a crew prepared to take them there safely. The captain was 45 years old with about 13 years at JetBlue. He had flown several types of aircraft, including the Airbus A320. With nearly 11,600 hours of total flying experience, he was well seasoned and rested, having flown only about 44 hours in the past month. The first officer was 40 years old with 8 years at JetBlue. He had over 3,300 hours flying, with similar aircraft ratings. Neither pilot had any record of previous accidents or incidents, and their training history was solid. Everyone expected this to be just another smooth flight. Two aircraft, a big JetBlue Airbus ready for a long flight to Florida and a smaller King Air coming in to land, were about to share a single runway. No controllers, just pilots and radio calls. What could possibly go wrong? At about 11:48 in the morning, the JetBlue crew announced on the CTAF radio that they were leaving the ramp area and taxiing to runway 10 for takeoff. Just seconds later, a Beechcraft King Air, a smaller twin-engine plane, checked in on the same radio frequency. The pilot said they were about 9 minutes away, coming in from the east, descending from 17,000 feet and planning to land on runway 10. That's when the Unicom operator, the person handling airport communications, replied that there were multiple aircraft inbound and that the winds were calm, giving the altimeter setting. It is a technical number important for altitude readings. The King Air pilot read back this information correctly. While the JetBlue crew was starting their second engine and running through their engine checks, the King Air pilot contacted Denver Air Route Traffic Control Center, ARTCC. He told them he was canceling his original instrument flight plan because he could now see the airport and planned to land visually on runway 28. It was the opposite runway from what he initially said. Denver Center acknowledged this change. Shortly after, the King Air announced on the CTAF that they were going to go ahead and land 28 and that they were straight in 28 right now, meaning they were lined up for a straight final approach to runway 28. So about 10 seconds later, JetBlue confirmed again that they were taxiing to runway 10. And the Unicom operator repeated the same message. Multiple planes inbound, and the wind was calm. Inside the cockpit, the pilots were focused, running through their checklist after starting the engines, everything moving smoothly, at least for now. Then at around 11:53, the King Air pilot called again on the shared radio frequency. This time, he said he was 12 miles out and lined up straight in for runway 28. Less than a minute later, the King Air pilot asked if anyone was planning to take off from runway 10. JetBlue replied they were holding short near the end of runway 10, waiting for clearance. The King Air pilot said he was about 10 miles out on final approach. JetBlue acknowledged and said they'd keep an eye out. Fast forward to 11:55, JetBlue contacted Denver Center and received clearance to take off from runway 10. They announced their intentions on the radio, expecting a smooth departure. But the King Air pilot was quick to speak up. He was already on short final for runway 28 and said he'd been trying to get their attention. JetBlue pilots thought the King Air was still much farther away, 8 or 9 miles out. However, the King Air pilot corrected them sharply. He was only about 4 miles away, or maybe even closer. The JetBlue co-pilot scanned outside, searching the skies, but the King Air simply wasn't there. Even their onboard radar showed nothing. Both pilots strained their eyes, but the smaller plane remained hidden, an invisible threat creeping closer with every second. They were hurtling down the runway, unaware that danger was closing in fast. Now JetBlue announced they were beginning their takeoff roll on runway 10. Then, over the radio, the King Air pilot said, "I'm on short final, and I hope you don't hit us." At that moment, tracking data showed the King Air was closing in on the opposite runway, less than 5 miles away. Around 11:57, JetBlue pushed the throttles forward and began its takeoff. Shortly before reaching the usual speed to lift off, the co-pilot asked if the King Air was on runway 28. The captain asked, "Is he?" The co-pilot said, "Yes, he is on 28. Do you see him?" The captain answered, "No." About 20 seconds after starting takeoff, the King Air asked if JetBlue planned to turn quickly after takeoff. JetBlue said yes. At that moment, the JetBlue captain pulled the plane's nose up earlier than normal, 24 knots before the usual rotation speed to avoid the King Air. In doing so, the tail of the JetBlue plane scraped the runway. The captain then climbed and turned sharply to the right, moving away from the King Air. Both aircraft were now safely in the air and on the ground, but just barely. But the story didn't end with just a scraped tail. That tail strike was a warning, a sign that something serious had just happened. Inside the cockpit, the pilots' hearts were pounding. They knew they had narrowly avoided disaster, but now they had to figure out exactly what had gone wrong. Shortly afterward, the captain informed the passengers. The tone was calm. He said they'd had a technical issue and would be landing in Denver instead. Passengers were likely relieved, especially those who had felt the strike. Was the damage severe? Could the plane still fly safely? Minutes felt like hours as the crew quickly ran through their checklists and talked to JetBlue's maintenance team on the radio. They decided to divert to Denver, a bigger airport with full support so the plane could be thoroughly inspected. The flight safely landed at Denver at 12:42 p.m. So what mistakes were made? And what lessons would be learned to keep something like this from ever happening again? When the National Transportation Safety Board investigated the incident, they uncovered a chain of mistakes and a pattern of human behavior. The biggest factor? Expectation bias. The JetBlue pilots were convinced from the very beginning that all incoming planes were landing on runway 10. It's what the airport usually uses. It's what the King Air had originally said. That belief shaped everything. Even when the King Air repeatedly announced he was landing on runway 28, the JetBlue crew didn't fully register it. Another factor? Non-standard communication. The King Air pilot never used the word runway in his calls. Instead of saying runway 28, he said things like straight in 28. To the JetBlue crew, already biased toward expecting traffic on 10, those calls didn't break through. It didn't sound urgent, it just sounded routine. Then came the early takeoff, a snap decision under pressure. Faced with an aircraft on the same runway, the JetBlue captain rotated too soon, trying to lift off early and get out of the way. In doing so, the tail struck the runway. According to the NTSB, that decision, while understandable, violated key safety procedures. In the aftermath, JetBlue took the incident seriously. They began working with instructors and training staff to improve how pilots operate at non-towered airports, where there's no air traffic control to guide every move. They also began reviewing procedures around tail strikes, communication, and how to follow emergency checklists more closely. And as for the pilots, the NTSB hasn't said what actions were taken, but in a just culture, pilots who report honestly and learn from mistakes are often given further training, not punishment. Because in aviation, mistakes do happen. What matters is that we learn from them, that we don't hide them, that we understand why they happened, so we can make sure they don't happen again. And for the 108 people on board JetBlue 1748 that day, they were lucky. What a close call, right? What do you think was the biggest challenge for the JetBlue crew that day? If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching. See you next time.